Welcome to episode 44 of A Gamer Looks at 40. I'm Bill Tucker. And as you know, if you've listened to this show for any length of time, I am all about stories. Not so much how games are made or how they're constructed or honestly even the quality. And I love those conversations. I have them all the time. But the point of this show is to bring out those stories, the personal opinions and feelings. And usually those feelings and opinions come from the hobby of it, right? The people playing them in their living rooms with brothers and sisters or in college in dorm rooms. That's the flavor I love. But some people's perceptions and experiences extend beyond the hobby and extend into portions of their real life. And I've had a few interviews with people who've done exactly that. My next guest, Daniel Greenberg, has taken that to the next level. Daniel is a professor of game design at George Mason University in Virginia, and he's also the founder of Winter & Studios. Winter & Studios is kind of a creative clearinghouse for academic content surrounding game. They do Ion Gaming, which are a series of Let's Plays where they discuss design and why things work and why they don't work. And they also participate in a number of academic panels and discussions at various conventions around the country. Really cool studio. Check them out, Winter & Studios. There'll be a link to their work in the show notes. And Daniel's unique experience and his fascinating story involves Final Fantasy VI. If you listen to this show and you've played the Super Nintendo, you love this game, but Daniel's experience with it, again, goes beyond just sitting in his room playing the game and being swept away. Let's join Daniel as we talk about his experience and walk through a life shaped by Final Fantasy VI. So our main focus tonight is to talk about Final Fantasy VI. I was going through Twitter and there was a thread, I think it was about Final Fantasy VI. I can't remember where it was. And you had posted some pretty interesting and almost personal feelings about this game, how it really impacted your life, how it almost served as a guidepost, from what I could tell in that very quick tweet, for a lot of what you do now. So I'd like to start with kind of the background, the setup, kind of how you felt when you first played it, when you first played it, and then maybe go into your history with it, your personal history. Sure. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So definitely when I first played it, this is not... they're very different sentiments, right? Because Final Fantasy VI, 3 in the US when it came out for the Super Nintendo in 1994, that's a 10-year-old Daniel that's playing that. And I did have experience with the previous two that had been released in America, 1 and 4. And I had some, I'd say, emotional or meaningful experiences with those games as well. Final Fantasy 1 is a game that I would play at my grandparents' house with some cousins. We'd all go, around the 4th of July to visit there. So I had, a lot of fun playing that. I never beat it at that age. I didn't beat it till I came back to the game much, much later. But kid me, enjoyed kind of just playing that game with family. Final Fantasy IV comes out in late 1991, pretty much right around when the system comes out.
Yep.
And so 7-year-old me, mercifully in part because that game had a fairly toned down difficulty, that's the first one that I really buckled down and beat. But it's notable because it's the game that taught me what death was conceptually. That, I prior to that, you could just, somebody died. Okay, fine, I'm a kid. I understand at the most base level. But, no, they are gone and they are not coming back. I remember when Tella dies. Apologies for spoiling. I'm sure I'm going to be doing much more of it when we get to Final Fantasy VI.
Indeed, yeah.
And, and when he dies... Anna dies before, but you don't get the chance to play as Anna. So it's sort of this, it kind of brushed by me. But when Tella dies and it occurs to me, something flips, my head and I go, oh, that's death. That's what death means. I just break into tears and go rushing to, I'm at my mother and stepfather's house at the time. And, I go to them crying and I'm like, Tella died. It's like, oh, well, don't you have a password or a save you can go back to? And, bless my parents, that they could say, it's like, no, he died and he's never coming back and he's gone. And I think then they kind of got it, and we had to sit and we had a little talk about, let's talk about death. So I know from a young age, I was somebody who could take messages from games, from a narrative perspective. I was always kind of open to that. Final Fantasy VI is at its core an ensemble cast. And it was a game that I loved, but I never got super attached to any one character emotionally when I was younger. For one Halloween, I went dressed as Locke, and everyone just thought I was a pirate, and that was fine. I still got candy anyway. I didn't complain. But it was just a game I played through. Mechanically, great. Soundtrack, amazing. Loved it. You couldn't pull me away from the game for, a couple years. But it was just a game. It wasn't until, 20 years after that point, or
Wow.
mid 2010s, that I reapproached Final Fantasy VI. And I reapproached it because I had started to work on my thesis concept. And I'm going to define a term here now, transmediation. If your audience isn't familiar, this is the concept of taking something from one artistic medium and moving it to another, right? The movie based on the book is a very popular one, or
Gotcha.
the movie based on the video game is a very depressingly popular one. And so my studies for my master's were largely in part, what happens when something moves from one form of art to another, which then leads into what tools do these various forms of art share? What do they do well? What does one do not so well that another can do? And what do you need to take into account if you're going to switch a story from one form to another? What do you need to take into account if you're going to try to tell some other medium's story? And as I was kind of playing through games and reading stuff and starting to attend operas, I kind of had this spark of inspiration, partly from seeing a very profound performance of La Boheme at the Kennedy Center, and partially just kind of from my own background and experience as a gamer. And I went, oh, the opera scene from FF6. That's a video game attempting to put on an opera. That's interesting. As a kid, it was kind of like, it almost felt like a farcical and fun thing. Now that I'm an adult, why don't I go back and look at it again? And so I looked at it, and that kind of got me down a rabbit hole of traditional opera and video games and where do those points of narrative overlap occur. And that was the seed that led to my thesis paper in 2017. So I basically spent a couple of years doing nothing but consuming video games and opera and getting lost in that world. And those were the same years that I was starting up WGS and starting to record, videos. So Final Fantasy VI kind of became the linchpin for who I was turning into as an adult, kind of my adult life. And I say that because it simultaneously occurred with me. I was single in 2015. I had a dependent family member that was kind of struggling, and I would help them with, things that they needed. But that relationship got strained, and I said, I'm working on a thesis paper. I'm trying to focus on my studies. I love you, but I need to, take some time away. And that time away, I met Alex, who is amazing and wonderful. She works for ZeniMax, so she's interested in games and understands a lot of the things we talk about. And she has a background and she has a master's in acting, and she's, just an amazing performer. And we had these weird overlaps where it's like we share these interests, and it's so, the Venn diagram of people who are interested in opera and interested in video games, it looks like two circles that are just very carefully trying to kiss. And somewhere on that dot is the two of us.
That's cool.
And now, fast forward 5 years, we're married, living in a great house in a nice neighborhood, and we have our son, and life is amazing, and I couldn't be happier. But if I'm not interested in games and opera, if I'm not pursuing that, if I'm not doing this sort of academic, artistic thing where I'm talking at MagFest and trying to look at this stuff, and I just kind of kept my head down and been a 9-to-5 programmer at the company I was working for, I'm not sure we meet. I'm not sure life takes the turns it does. So, obviously a fair amount of that is serendipitous.
Sure.
But, technically speaking, it would be unfair of me to say otherwise. Most of the turns my life has taken in the last decade are largely in part to what I chose to study, which at its core was Final Fantasy VI.
That's very sweet, and I find it very interesting that the game, not only that it really touched you as an adult, because a lot of people, when you talk about Final Fantasy VI, they'll have childhood recollections. And it's very interesting I'm having this conversation with you today because another podcast I'm friends with, they just did a Final Fantasy VI episode and did a really wonderful, I don't want to say dissection, but a deep dive into what makes it work. And they were saying basically the same thing as you, that it's really framed like an opera.
I have to ask, Weekly Pod?
No, MageCast.
Okay. Oh yeah. And, that's right. Yes. Weekly Red Mage just did that. That was excellent.
Well, Red Mage. Yeah, it's really, really great. Yes. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of bits of Final Fantasy VI I never noticed. And a lot of the grace notes of that game, which of course it's a phenomenal world-class game, but the grace notes of it that they discussed were really interesting. So when you mentioned like an opera, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah. I just heard this. Like, I went to the dentist today. This was 8 hours ago, and I
actually think it was the Well-Read Mages podcast that got me down that Twitter. Not that
okay.
I think I'm on Twitter way too much. Anyway,
same.
But I do think it was actually that responding to that podcast that got me down the rabbit hole that actually put the post up that got me here.
Do you see the ripples of Final Fantasy VI in other forms of transmedia? Because obviously Final Fantasy VI was a very influential game. Do you see that other places? Kind of like that operatic style, looking down from the mezzanine, as it were, in that style? Like,
I don't, not to be a downer necessarily, I don't know. No. I see a ton of it. Okay. I think a lot of what Final Fantasy VI did was because of the constraints that they had at the time.
Sure.
Like things like the text boxes communicating what you're singing is because, they just didn't have full voiceovers for anything. But the good news for that is, now we're basically mirroring the effect of having surtitles, like if you were listening to an opera in another language. The fact that the characters have to do these big, pronounced emotional movements to convey emotion because you're looking at these little tiny sprites and they can't do very subtle things with their faces. Well, opera's the same way, right? You're sitting farther away, so it has to be big, evocative movements and actions to communicate things, for the people on stage. So again, there's kind of just a nice point of overlap, but it's because the game required you to do that, right? If you were, say, if the unthinkable were to happen, if we got an FF6 remake, and just how emotionally, connecting you can be, they have to be careful there, right? Because the performance in an opera has to be grandiose. It has to be kind of larger than life because those are the motions that get your concept across to the audience and allow them to see sort of even what is intended in the libretto to be sort of a poignant moment or a moment of reflection has to be communicated in kind of a bold way by the performer.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that games have not evolved from, FF6 or that FF6 isn't a tremendous standard bearer for what games can do as a narrative form. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that games are constantly running back to and referencing, how did they do this? How can we do this? Or how can we do this better? Just because, the JRPG got a whole lot of run from 1994 into the mid 2000s. I mean, there was that period where obviously Chrono Trigger followed it up and is considered kind of even more legendary in scope. And then PS1 and PS2 era, just had tons and tons of games. It was kind of a golden period for the genre. And I think there was a lot of innovation that came through in that time, both mechanically and story-wise. But I also think the genre evolved a lot towards different conventions that aren't necessarily where FF6 was at the time. FF6 is, despite the pixel remaster's colorization, it's a fairly dark, steampunkish kind of world. It's an ensemble cast that doesn't have a central hero. There's a lot of stuff it does that you just don't see emulated all that often, if at all. And there's reasons for that. There's pretty defined market study that says a well-defined singular central protagonist sells a lot better, and that players tend to attach to them. And a lot of that, is, stems from the kind of the open world craze we've been in the last, dozen plus years. There's other elements too, if as games get more and more complicated and more elegant to make, can you afford to develop 14 characters as easily as you can maybe 2 or 3? Imagine a game like Grand Theft Auto 5 with 14 playable characters. The mind reels, right? You're asking so much of, it's already an artist's team and an animator team, and there's so many people doing rigging and IK management and texturing, and not to mention the time spent in the black box, covered in ping pong balls, doing mocap, and there's just so much that goes into game development now that to ask a studio to be like, okay, we want to do a big, JRPG with 14 characters, but we want to do it in this modern style. That is a massive, massive undertaking. At some point, the bean counter is going to say, hey, can we get the characters down to 8?
Yeah, and can we get this game shipped? Because we can't give you 10 years to make this thing, right?
Right.
Which, in the end of the day, it's a consumer product that, of course, is a piece of art in most people think estimations these days, but it also is a product that has to get out there and start making money. That is the reality of the industry, of course. You mentioned Final Fantasy VI does not have a central hero, and that's true. There's no Chrono, there's no Titus or Titus or however you pronounce it. We can't get into that conversation. There's no central hero, but if you had to pick one person in that game as the main antagonist, who do you think would serve that role if you had to pick somebody?
I mean, if it's antagonist, it's Kefka Palazzo.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm protagonist. Protagonist. I'm sorry.
So let's say it's a game in 2 acts. The world of balance is basically Terra, and the world of ruin is basically Celis. And I think it's not really a controversial take, really.
No.
They are the 2 that probably have the most central story focus. With the first half being, how do the returners deal with Terra when she's liberated from the Empire, and how do they interact with the Empire, and sort of the consequences of those actions. And the second half is basically, again, we're obviously going to get into spoiler territory here.
Of course.
After the world falls apart, how does Celis manage her feelings of responsibility, and how does she sort of pick herself back up and, get the band back together, as it were.
Right. I agree. I think Terra, although you definitely spend more time with Celis and in the world of Ruin, Terra is still strongly felt, because in the end, it's still a lot riding on her kind of rediscovering who she is, even though it is a bit of a side quest when you kind of unlock full Terra, rediscovering who she is and kind of coming to grips with that. But in the world of balance, it's absolutely Terra. Everything hinges on her. She is the subject of the sentence almost, or the object of the sentence. Like, she is where everything is kind of pointing towards her. So I 100% agree. As far as the characters go, Final Fantasy VI has a huge roster of characters. I mean, I've never played Chrono Cross. I'm looking forward to playing it actually on the Switch when it comes out.
Right.
I think it's got a similar amount or maybe more. I don't know, but Final Fantasy VI has a ton.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
when I think of large casts, I always think of the Suikoden series, right? The whole 108 Stars of Destiny, the games that are, again, transmediation based on the Water Margin, one of the four sort of great works of Chinese literature, along with, the three other texts, and Water Margin, it's 108 characters. How do you make it, it interesting with 108? And to the game's credit, especially the first one, which we played through for the channel, okay, well, some of the characters can be cooks and getting them, unlocks something, or one of them can be the person that has a storage room for you. One of them could be somebody that runs a bathhouse in the tower, and so on and so forth. So, if you're going to have 108 characters, they need to perform some really ancillary tasks, if anything at all. When you get to a smaller cast, fewer than 20, then they all kind of have to be at least notable, if not heroes in their own rights. Because, you're really going to drag, this person in here and make me remember another name and make me care about someone and build up some interest in somebody if they don't perform, some sort of function there.
Right. So, and I agree. I think it's the large cast. I think there is some fluff in the cast. Like, I'm not saying unnecessary, because I do think all the characters are necessary to a point, but definitely are your main characters and your minor character and your supporting cast, which is fine, because just like a film, not everybody has the lead role, right?
Yeah, and I always kind of felt that both Gogo and Umaro were, it's nice that they're there.
Yeah.
But when you get to the final tower, you can take 12 people because you can do 3 groups of 4.
Right.
So not really involving either of them beyond, hey, it's cool to take a mime along.
Yeah.
That Gogo is kind of this amorphous character of, unknown, background and, unknown gender and unknown kind of details, and just, somebody that you can sort of bring along. And Umaro, I think, had the potential to be something along the lines of, not comic relief necessarily, but to be built up alongside Mog or explained a little better, like in Narsh's, context, but doesn't really. And obviously there's only so much you can get on the cart, and there's only so much time you can get into it. And FF6 is a game that, the characters all got developed by different people, right? Katase was responsible for some, and Nomura was responsible for some, and so forth. Right. So, you're taking all of this writing from all these, different principal creators and kind of stitching something together. So it's just human nature that some, are going to get lost in the wash.
Absolutely. And again, that's fine. I mean, in the case of Umaro and Gogo, I always just saw them as like gamer treats. Like these, not even so much characters as they're just,
that's fair. It's basically like a mime and a berserker.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, yeah. I mean, it's neat to put a blitz on Gogo and now have 2 people on your team that can do the highest blitz and just wreck everything. It's pretty nice. But and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? It's cool to have that, those kind of characters. They're kind of more just secrets, they're nice to have, as I agree with you. But even like a Strago and a Realm, while they have, a pretty cool story, they're definitely side story to your cells and to your Locke and to your Cyan and all that sort of thing. So, which is fine. Again, not everybody has to be the star. Just wanted to take a break from the scintillating conversation to thank my wonderful patrons. Dan from Retro Logic, Ryan Payne of the Gamers Week podcast, and my brother from another mother, quite literally, Pete Harney, and a brand new member of the team of exceptional podcast patrons, Steph Sergil from the All N podcast. He's a great guy. He was on my show earlier this month. His story of Zelda will be shared, and it's a good one. It's a really good one. Might be its own episode. I don't know. There's too much stuff there. Regardless, we are now 1 person shy of a hockey team. All right, so please don't leave us off the bench and join these exceptional gentlemen today on patreon.com/agamerlooksat4040. $2 get you early access to shows, polls, and all sorts of other madness I attempt to do for my beloved patrons. Once again, that's patreon.com/agamerlooksat4040. But when you look at that wide cast, which character do you feel the closest connection to?
Oh gosh. I would say probably Locke, and that comes from a little bit of having that same sort of reckless idealism and sort of the belief that you can turn things around, you can make your world better if you're willing to, to go out there and give it your best. I've always kind of been a reckless optimist in that regard, but also partially because Locke, and this is something you don't see games do a ton, Locke is heroic because he doesn't know how not to be, and his backstory almost necessitates him trying to behave a certain way. I mean, he gives clues to, the cast along the way, like, he's this way because, there's a problem there. It's not that, this is a normal way to behave. And, it's when he discovers that Tara has amnesia that he suddenly feels a need to protect her, because that's kind of transmitting back to his experiences with Rachel before then. And that sort of flawed, having a flawed emotional state, but not allowing that to get in the way of trying to do good works is a really nice, it's a nice character archetype almost. You typically see characters who have emotional or mental issues or trauma or flaws like that. Sometimes like a developer feels a need to over exaggerate that or, bring that into being part of their mechanical behavior. That someone is, they're a little bit crazy, or they're somebody who is stricken with grief and is, constantly in this melancholy state. Locke is somebody who is not well, and doesn't really get his resolution. Like most characters, he doesn't get his resolution until the World of Ruin. But at the same time, he's capable of functioning and kind of functioning in a way that he's clearly trying his hardest and doing his best. But he can still be seen by his, compatriots and the people close to him as being not quite 100%. That he's not as well as someone who didn't know him and didn't look at him at the surface would think.
And I love the relationship between him and Celis. It's one of my favorites in games, probably. How their relationship naturally develops through trials and shared experience, and how they both come to grips with each other's issues and baggage. I think. Yeah,
I've played just enough modern, especially some of these open world games, enough modern adventures or action RPGs, or, to the romances feel so contrite, so forced, this game is a sandbox, so we have to provide you one or more romantic options along the way.
Right.
Whereas, in Final Fantasy VI, Terra's relationship, romantically is, it's with herself and her past and children and being a maternal figure. And with Celis, it's sort of overcoming traumatic experience of being a child soldier in an experiment, and the Emperor essentially intending to pair her up with Kefka, and sort of coming to grips with herself as a person, and all of her experiences with Locke. There's never sort of this forced romance. The writers don't feel the need to kind of shove them together romantically. Instead, the game takes all of the twists and turns it does, and the characters grow closer over the course of the game because of the tribulations they share either together, the things that they experience while they're, in the same party, or independently. That is to say, Celis's experience on the island when she, wakes up in the world of ruin, or Locke's experience when he can finally kind of put his grief or his guilt really for Rachel's condition behind him. As they both kind of evolve and grow, their feelings for each other just are a natural consequence of those things, as opposed to say, well, we're 2/3 of the way through the game, we just need to take two characters and shove them together for the players', amusement.
Yeah, and it's and modern romance, when you're given the option, is very binary, or it's a Bethesda tree. You get 3 options: good, indifferent, or bad, right? And of course, as we all know, relationships don't work that way, and I think games are still trying to figure that out in this modern context when giving players expression and wanting to give players the ability to make choices. I think that's definitely one of the things that kind of one of the next frontiers is really allowing players to create meaningful relationships that feel earned, as opposed to, like you kind of put it, shoved together, for lack of a better term.
And it's tricky. We have this feeling that we need to implement mechanics into so much. We need to get mechanics into romance options because we have mechanics for collect 10 of these. We have mechanics for gain a level. We have mechanics for the weapon strength of whatever. And that's not, relationships, the heart, the human experience is not typically that calculated, We've been writing poetry for thousands of years about, how spontaneous love can be, or how unique it can be, that it can be experienced platonically, that it can be experienced romantically, that it can, be quick and burn out and be wonderful and gone, or it can be something that, slowly develops over years. And there are so many different routes it takes. And I think one of our weaknesses right now is that I think this is largely confined to the AAA space. I'm not going to speak for indies because there's just so much amazing, beautiful stuff being produced by the independent community.
Absolutely.
But I think right now we feel this need to kind of, it's another mechanic. It's another thing we need to do in the theme park. We need to have it available. And so there's got to be steps to make it happen. And that's not really how love works. You don't, just kind of go through your 10-step, GameFAQs guide to, GameFAQs, I'm dating myself. You don't go through, this sort of rote thing like, well, if I complete these 7 quests and I have this item, and I'm in this inn, at the right time, magic happens and the characters get together. It should not go down that way. And it's unfortunate that I think right now, the design and development of larger AAA open world games just kind of lends itself to, theme. It's a theme park. It has attractions, it has rides, and one of those rides is find somebody to hook up with, and so there's sort of this. It needs to be structured in the same mechanical veins or context.
Final Fantasy VI does that amazingly well. It's you can wander around, but the sandboxes Final Fantasy VI gives you, for the most part, unless you're in the airship, that's a different thing. For the most part, you're in sections that have like 3 areas in it,
right? And 3 or 4. Say, they limit the sandbox, and I think this is this might be one of the things that could be learned as a lesson from Final Fantasy VI. The sandbox is the second half of the game. The first half of the game is actually a pretty linear, fairly well-curated experience that gets you deeply and emotionally attached to the characters, but controls its pacing very well. The only part where it gets a little sandboxy, it even controls that, is when you break the party off into 3 separate groups and you experience each one's story individually before they all converge again. Right. But the first half of the game is very controlled, It doesn't allow you to wander around all that much. It's the second half of the game when you get to the world of ruin, and you have that freedom that it really does kind of open up. And in that sense, by then you're already invested. You already understand the characters. You know enough about the story that I don't think wandering off the beaten path is all that harmful. Right. If you allow that to happen, like you said in Fallout 4, you can do it pretty much off the bat. If you're not doing that until after Kefka has, taken control of the statues and started releasing the light of judgment on the world, you really change how the sandbox is treated.
Right. That's interesting. And also, too, when you're in the sandbox sections of the second half, the threat isn't a ticking timer. The threat is a bored deity, basically, God figure, who just needs to be stopped, but not right this second. So there's just enough stakes where at any moment he could destroy, Mobliz or destroy a town. Mm-hmm. But it's not like the giant laser in the sky that's in the midst of destroying New York. You know what I mean? It's right. You still have that room to play. And even if you have the room to play, there's not a ton of places to play anyway. I mean, you can go to different towns and get a lot more world building and explore. But also because the main drive too is, like you said before, getting the band back together. That's another big driving force. It's kind of twofold. So it's a very interesting way of getting it to the point where by the time you get to play in the sandbox, you already are invested. That's a really great way of putting it. Final Fantasy 13 does a similar thing where the first 20 hours you're walking in a straight line, essentially. Mm-hmm. And then you get released onto the green pasture. Right, and by then the expectation... Yeah, exactly. And by then you're expected to be invested in everything going on where you fully get the chance to just wander and explore. So
I think my only disappointment there was that I think it happened way too late. I mean, by the time you're at Grand Pulse, you're already about 80 to 90% of the way through the game.
I would say probably maybe 70%, but you're way through it. Right. Yeah, you are a ways in. You mentioned the antagonist. Wow, I cannot get those two things straight.
All right.
You mentioned the antagonist, of course, which is Kefka, who is... People love Kefka. I asked this question via a comment on MageCast, and it sparked, I think, 15 minutes worth of conversation about it. And I didn't get made fun of, but it's a genuine question. Very simply... Is Kefka a good villain? And when I say good, because on the surface, Kefka has a very single-minded motivation. Right? They're not terribly complex. Kind of just evil for the sake of being evil. There's not much development. He's kind of the killer clown, right? Who's kind of this agent of chaos. Without kind of parroting what the podcast said, what's your take on it? Do you think Kefka is a good villain?
I do. And I guess I will cheat a little bit and I'll refer to my own thesis here. Okay. Bravocelis. My comparison for Kefka is Baron Scarpia, who is the chief of police in, I don't know if you're familiar with the opera Tosca.
I'm not.
But basically, this is a guy who is kind of just... He has no moral compass per se. And you can try to go back into his past and dig up why, right? He's another one of these child soldiers that has been infused with, Magitech, and they think that, they're going to turn him into something amazing, and he's sort of the first failed experiment, and Celes is the successful experiment. And so obviously it does, it knocked a couple screws loose, and he's kind of, like you said, this sort of killer, crazy, clownish character. And, he is introduced in a way that makes him seem silly when, the Figaro scene, except the fact that he burns the castle down, right? And he intends to basically kill everybody there. There is no depth to his depravity, that he will not reach, poisoning Doma and killing everybody. Whether that is couched in a veneer of something playful or, sort of this, I don't know. It's not really, opera buffa. It's not, he is kind of bumbling and silly, but malintentioned. He is very poignantly and maliciously malintentioned, and is simply somebody taking advantage of his station and position and ability to see through his own sort of nihilistic vision of the world.
Right.
And in that sense, I think too often we make assumptions about antagonists, or we make assumptions about villains, that villains need to be entirely competent, that villains need to be, either insane and thus need to be stopped because their condition can't be treated, or they need to be perfectly sane and comprehensible and their plans need to be structured and well-formed and we have to stop them before they come to fruition. And I think what makes Kefka successful is Kefka reminds us that villains, and this is as much in real life as it is in, the world of narrative, villains do not need to be perfectly coherent. Villains do not need to constantly give you their master plan. They don't need to narrate it all to Bond before they send him to the laser sharks.
Right.
Villains can be flawed people, evil or well-intentioned. In Kefka's case, pretty clearly evil, sort of just scrapping their way to success, or scrapping their way towards the failure of others, or taking advantage of their station and their position, or taking advantage of opportunities as they arise, as he does on the floating continent. Villains can succeed without masterstrokes, right? You don't need Ozymandias revealing his thing, 20-something minutes after he's already succeeded. Villains do not have to be untouchable masterstrokes of genius. Antagonism functions to sort of motivate and drive our story, and to frame the actions of our characters in a way that allows them to seem heroic, or to attempt to accomplish or save something, or do something that meets with our expectations morally or emotionally. And Kefka functions as someone who's immediately intriguing to the viewer, is understood to be a threat, but is underestimated oftentimes because of his sort of clownish behavior and his presentation and even the song. And I think as he evolves and as as his atrocities pile up, it can be very easy for the player to be, especially on a first playthrough, somewhat struck by his ability to succeed and to take advantage of the moment, and to become sort of this larger than life, monstrous demigod by the game's second half, because he's so often portrayed the way Ultros is actually portrayed, which is this, sort of this comic villain, really.
Yeah, very comic,
right?
Yeah.
Ultros is the absurd, buffo that Kefka is alluded to being occasionally. But he is absolutely, an antagonist. He is a chaotic antagonist. He is an unstable antagonist, and his philosophy is sort of this discordant nihilism. But he is definitely a well-structured antagonist, and one of the reasons the game remains as memorable as it is.
I tend to agree. And the reason I asked that question in that way is because when I look at characters from a film perspective, especially, I'm always looking for characters that have some more nuance, or villains or antagonists that have that kind of nuance. But at the same time, one of the comparisons they made on the show, and I've made as well, is it's like the Emperor in Star Wars. The Emperor does not have a deep backstory. We don't know where he came from. We don't know why he wants to control the world. But he's a lot of fun watching him be this kind of agent of power and agent of influence, and this friction point for our protagonist to work against. Because again, like you said, you need something to, or someone to drive that. And I think Kefka is just a lot of fun. And he's terrifying. I mean, just from a basic standpoint, this unreasonable force that has the ability to, again, destroy a town by looking at it, to just wants to quote Moses from that show to build a monument to nothingness, right? He just wants to build this a palace of destruction because I don't know, he just wants to, because that's his aim. It's terrifying, not terribly deep or I would say traditionally interesting, but as that friction point is very effective. So I think Kefka is an extremely effective villain if he's not like a wonderfully realized character.
Sure.
And I think you can have both, so I would definitely agree with. What aspect of Final Fantasy VI is the most load-bearing, you think? Has the most work to do to make Final Fantasy VI the classic and the epic that it is? Where do you think most of which is the most load-bearing piece of the Final Fantasy VI puzzle?
It's close. There's part of me that wants to say the soundtrack is what holds this entire thing together. Partially because the composition is so operatically structured that it uses leitmotif the way it does. That the final two things that happen in the game, the battle with Kefka at the end and sort of the post hoc resolution scenes, those two songs are like 40 minutes long combined. It's like 17 minutes for Dancing Mad and like 20-something minutes for the conclusion. And those songs are beautifully complex, interwoven, multi-stage, movements that describe in music everything that has kind of brought you to this point or everything that kind of concludes. You talked about Celis and Locke and their relationship together, and their song during the ending is this really cleverly interwoven version of both of their themes playing simultaneously.
So
and it's, so much of the game is definitely that artistic design that comes from the music and the usage of that music, and as a mood setter, as a way to define the characters, as a way to tell the story just as well as any other part of the game. So the soundtrack's a huge part of it, but that is not to say, and I will say this, I have played the game on mute before. I have been a kid who did not want to wake his parents because he knew he would get grounded if he did, and have played Final Fantasy, 6 on mute, and still absolutely enjoyed it, and still felt completely sucked into its world.
Interesting.
And so, if that's the case, I have to be, give just as much, credence to, the structure of its characters. There are 14 characters in this game, and it is not hard to fall in love with them or care about them or be interested in their world. A little bit of that is mechanic, right? They were very well designed to give each one or two unique abilities that help frame them in combat. Some of that is the pacing, that they come and go over the course of the game, and you get experience with all of them. Some of that is the latter stage of the game and kind of the motivation to find everybody and build them up, especially as you get more and more powerful espers and the leveling bonuses that kind of come with that. So even mechanically, you start to get invested in building these characters up. And that's, again, very common in JRPGs. But this is a game that is basically held up by its characters. Not just its protagonists, but its antagonists, its side characters, even sort of the characters that make up its ancillary moments, Bannon or Leo or the Impresario or Gal's father. That this is really, it is a character-driven story. Most Final Fantasies are, but maybe more so just because it doesn't really have a choice. It does not follow a lot of the traditional high fantasy beats that a number of other Final Fantasies do. It does not take place in a world like Ivalice that has been established by anything else or has any sort of defining, understanding characteristics other than what it tells within itself. So it really does rely upon a heavy investment in the cast to get into. And by virtue of that, the cast is verbose. There's tons of dialogue.
Oh, yeah.
You basically, while you are playing this game, are reading a novel in blue text boxes. And that novel is getting you invested in the lives of these dozen plus people.
No, that's pretty fantastic. I framed that question because I think music is very, very, very close, and it's almost an opportunity to talk about music because the soundtrack of this game, I could probably spend a good half an hour just talking about the soundtrack, which is exceptional. It's just exceptional. I don't think there's a down song in it. But I also agree. I think the characters are really what moves it forward, and since most of that story and emotion is shown not only through the text, but also through just the animations and the simple animations that they were able to put together and very cleverly use a limited scope and a limited set of expressions and movements to convey so much is extraordinary. So yeah, I think we're on the same page with that one. I was so glad we said music first. I'm like, yeah, that music is so good. If you met somebody, maybe even like a student, right, who walks into one of your classes, and you learn they've never played Final Fantasy VI, they've just, there's a million things to play, just haven't gotten around to it. What would be your elevator pitch to them to encourage them to try it?
Oh gosh, part of me is loath to get any of my students, especially if I'm teaching them that semester, to get invested into a JRPG while I'm trying to teach them.
Maybe I'd like, good point.
Okay, so when summer break rolls around, if you're interested, no, I would say it is a game that perhaps more than any other shows you how compelling and how moving a narrative, how artistically compelling a story you can tell with a very, very limited technical set. I mean, the SNES had, 8 channels for that sound? Kefka's laugh, being compressed the way it is. Mode 7 needing to be used, like when you're flying towards Vector, to kind of have it slowly coming up over the horizon. While the sort of the underneath you is moving at scale. It's you don't have this endless toolkit, and students in game design now, it's amazing what you can do with things like Unity or Unreal out of the box.
Sure.
It is it is so intimidating when you think of orchestral soundtracks now and these expansive, 3D environments. Even students who are making portfolio games are typically making something that is, from a technical standpoint, the tools that they have at their disposal. It's just so big in what they can do, right? It's so expansive in the possibilities that they have and what's in front of them. And I think what Final Fantasy VI could potentially do is say, if you scale down your tool set, if you scale down what you can do audiovisually, if you scale down your presentation, it does not scale down the artistic value or the impact that a game like this can have. If anything, it forces you to thrive in those constrained conditions. And it really might be a great way to say, oh, hey, I can do this. I think you look at things like Super Mario Maker or RPG Maker, and they're a great way for people who enjoy those games or those worlds to kind of get a feel for development. And there's a thriving RPG Maker community. You know, they make a lot of stuff there. But it all comes from people who are already in that world or already fans of that type of game. And I think you need to, maybe more than ever, because we had the benefit, my generation had the benefit of growing up with games and seeing them from their earliest inception to today. And I think it's easier for somebody of my age to appreciate what different games at different eras can do better or worse. You know, my students come into class and they will tell me they grew up, you know, with a 360, or they grew up with the, you know, the PS3. And that quickly ages you, just listening to that. But it also reminds you that, hey, you know, this means that everything they know about 20th century games, you know, it's 2022 now. My students were born after 9/11. You know, the things that their world, their experiences, both inside games and out, are completely different, you know, totally. from the ones, you know, that I had. And so understanding that 20th century gaming is literally game history to these students. You know, we call it game history, and we don't think about it like, yeah, this, you know, this game that I loved playing came out 20 years before you were born. And so you have to think about this as it is an education in the art form. And Final Fantasy VI, it takes a little while. And it's probably not the first game I would recommend to someone who's interested in learning, you know, storytelling in games.
Sure.
But I think it is, and I have started going down this road of game appreciation, and it's something that it's probably going to be my eventual publication for the doctorate if I end up finishing my academic pursuits. But we talk about art appreciation as, you know, the things you need to study and understanding the periods to be able to consume art intelligently, whatever that means, right? And we all understand what an art appreciation course is if you take it in college. Right. It is time for game appreciation. We are at the point now where it is an old enough and mature enough form it is well enough structured, well enough defined. We have enough history and enough that we can group things into. This is what we talk about when we talk about the 8-bit era or the 16-bit era. You know, we can say, you know, this is a period mud. We can say that, you know, this particular MMO follows the pattern that was established by precursors like EverQuest or Ultima Online. You know, that we now have enough structure that we can talk about game appreciation the same way we talked about art appreciation. And the books are not out there yet. And, you know, if you're listening to this and you beat me to it, hey, more power to you. But I think Final Fantasy VI is one of those games that is going to be on the sidebar of a page of a book on game appreciation that's going to talk about what JRPGs can do, what that genre is capable of in terms of building the player's investment in a story and in characters, and combining these limited but powerful audiovisual tools to produce an extremely moving piece of art.
That's really fascinating. That's a really fantastic answer, because it encapsulates a lot. And I love the idea of game appreciation. I've made the analogy in the past, and this is usually when talking about BioShock, because I feel like I've spent years now talking about BioShock in one way or another, that if games were a college, BioShock would be required for all majors. Like, it really would. There's certain games, like tentpole games, that caused maybe a sea change, but definitely had major influence. Like Portal.
No, that was a good pun, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Oh, did I? Oh, look at that! I didn't even see it coming. I didn't see. It's late. Did the puns disappear? You know, like Portal and Final Fantasy VI might be that kind of thing, where to kind of have that articulation point of the point when the 16-bit RPG really reached that, and Chrono Trigger. It might, you know, it would be a split course. I don't know, but where they had for storytelling in games using a limited toolkit, were able to do so much. And I think it's a very interesting where RPGs went from there to the PlayStation era, which there are fantastic RPGs for that, to the PlayStation and PS2, like you said. But man, it's a very interesting articulation point. Very well said. And I would read that game appreciation book. So I would read that tomorrow. That sounds fascinating. Thanks again to Daniel for taking the time out of his busy schedule to chat with me about all things Final Fantasy VI. If you want to check out his work at Winteron Studios, the link is in the show notes. Do check it out. And also, if you enjoyed this episode, I think MageCast has an awesome episode for you to enjoy as well. He did an episode on Final Fantasy VI, and it's fascinating. I mentioned this in the show. Highly recommend it. The episode is entitled The Divine Absurdity. It's episode 72. Be sure to check that out. And if this is the first time you've heard A Gamer Looks at 40, welcome! I do all sorts of shows with different topics and different people. Be sure to check out the previous shows. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I hope you enjoy it. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all the social media places you can find me for all sorts of content in all sorts of places, mostly on Twitter. That's where I post almost every day, so be sure to check out my musings there. And tell a friend, rate and review. I will say this until the day I die. Ratings and reviews are vital on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Thanks again for taking time out to check out this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40 and continue being awesome.